so we are officially recording right now, and I would like to thank all of you for joining the class via Adobe Connect. And perhaps we will have a few other participants joining us as the presentation starts. So today we have the honor of having Dr. Becca Kennedy join us from upstate New York. I actually met Dr. Kennedy when she was a grad student at Old Dominion University. I was actually a graduate student in the Instructional Design and Technology program, and she was in the Human Factors Psychology program. And we just, our interests are very similar related to the design and development of simulation. I believe she will talk about her experience in the presentation. But she has an expertise in user experience design, and I figured that that would be an interesting topic for us to cover in our multimedia class. So with that, I'm going to pass it over to Dr. Becca Kennedy. Becca, please.
Hey, you can still hear me, right? Cool. Is my screen, how do I get my screen going?
Okay, so I'm gonna stop sharing and then you can go to share
Okay.
my screen.
Awesome. Oh, and ask me which display I want. Cool. All right, did that work? Okay. I just wanted to make sure I had my chat up. So I can see your chat window. That's going to be all I can really see for now. So I'm going to rely on Dr. Romero-Hall to be the moderator. So I do want to have a lot of conversation and discussion with you guys. I don't want this to just be me talking, because this is a topic that every single person can relate to, whether you're a designer, whether you're an academic, no matter what, you have experiences every day, and those experiences are design. So I'm here to kind of introduce that topic to you guys, and Nolde gave a great introduction, which I really appreciate. But I do have a PhD in human factors psychology from Old Dominion University, so that's my super academic experience. My dissertation actually had a lot of instructional design crossover in it. I normally don't get to talk about it too much because most people honestly don't care, but I'm going to take the opportunity to talk about it now very briefly, which is that for my dissertation, I looked at using storytelling in a training context, specifically for giving performance feedback. The idea being that stories and specifically narratives are a lot better for memory and emotion and all these things that would help a person learn, in this case, communication skills. So that's what I studied for the last 4 years doing my dissertation, but finally that's done as of June. So I'm also a user experience consultant, which is, thank you, which is very similar to human factors. So human factors is basically the study of human-technology interaction for the purposes of safety and usability and effectiveness, and there's a lot of military and aviation and medical human factors people. User experience uses a lot of those same skills and ways of thinking and processes, but it's applied usually to commercial products. So for example, our experience with Adobe Connect so far has been pretty okay, right? Some of us had trouble connecting. There were little hiccups here and there. So that's an example of a user experience. We're each users of Adobe Connect right now. Some of us are presenters, some of us are audience members. And of course, I'm going to talk a lot more about that. I have worked in healthcare, tech startups, higher education, and government. So I've gotten a lot of experience in different areas. Unfortunately, a lot of my specific experiences I can't talk about because of non-disclosure reasons, but I can give plenty of examples from the real world, which maybe people like better anyway. So with that, I don't know if you guys had the opportunity to read the article I suggested. Whether you did or didn't, it doesn't really matter right now, but the idea of the article, which is from 2002, was talking about this intersection between products that are beautiful, well-designed in that visual respect, and usable. So actually serving their purpose and being easy to use. And this article and a lot of Don Norman's writing, Don Norman is, by the way, considered to be the godfather of user experience by a lot of people. But this writing actually predated the widespread use of the term user experience. So before I even get into the specifics of UX, I thought it might be nice to talk a little bit about this idea. Can you guys still hear me? Okay.
Yes, I can.
All right. Yeah, just let me know if anything goes a little funky. So I wanted to present these questions. I'm interested in what you guys think about these ideas. First of all, how do emotions impact the products we use? We know that we tend to choose to use things that we like. But specifically, can you guys think of examples of products you use that are either ugly but serve a great purpose and you keep using it, or beautiful but hard to use? I will start off by talking about something I use every single day, which is so ugly, but I love it. And it's a makeup case that is hot pink. And if you look through my entire house, there's not another thing in here that's hot pink. I'm not into that. But it is the exact size of what I need to be able to carry my makeup around to the gym with me. It's like this really ugly plastic. It doesn't look well made at all, but that means it doesn't get wet. So I continue to use that despite there being much better looking products out there because it serves the purpose I need. Can you guys think of any examples from your lives? So either something that doesn't look good but you like it, or it looks good and you don't like it. Most bulky pens. That's interesting. And cars. Oh, so is your car? Oh, yeah. So cars are a huge topic of conversation. I can agree with that too. I like Sharpie pens best. So the point really is that, of course, items that are useful and usable and well designed and look good is the ultimate goal, but sometimes there's a little bit of a trade-off. Small sized umbrella. Yeah, so that's kind of like my makeup case. It's small enough to be portable, but maybe not cute. Oh, uncomfortable shoes. I've never thought of that as an example, but totally. I'm loving these examples. And I'm sure you will think of more things while I'm giving examples and talking. So maybe at the end, if you have good examples to share, we can come back to this. So let's jump into the actual UX part of things. So of course, the first question is, what is UX? Besides a buzzword, I will say it's a very common word that's thrown around right now, specifically in web design or tech communities, and people don't necessarily know what it means. They just know that it's important. What it is the process of creating products that are useful, easy to use, and fun to use. So the user interface is one part of it, but really the experience is any touch point you have with a product. And I specify digital or physical because most of what we talk about and read about is digital, but it also applies equally to physical products. So designing things that are ergonomic, for example, or designing environments like the waiting room at a hospital, for example, has an experience to it. It might fall under something more specific than user experience, like patient experience or driver experience or something like that. But it's kind of a really broad field involving really creating anything that a human's going to use. So some related fields are usability, interaction design, interface design, and human-computer interaction. Some of those fields are more academic than others. Some people are really doing research to understand how people think and interact with things to kind of inform design rules or design decisions. A lot of times, though, people who work in UX are working on the commercial side of things. So we might work a little bit more with marketing, for example, to make sure we are creating something with users' needs in mind, but also the business needs in mind. No matter what, it involves research to understand the needs of users. So that's really the core of it, is doing actual research with humans. And I gotta say, if that weren't enough to take in, because people's expectations are always changing, UX always needs to change too. So the way we interact with our phones, for example, is much different than the way we did 5 years ago or 10 years ago, right? So being a UX professional also means keeping up with trends and keeping up with new technology. I'm going to throw some examples of good user experience at you, just a few of them, really to get you thinking about how this exists everywhere around you. The first example is something that is a really common example, actually, and it's the upside down ketchup bottles as an example of redesigning something that presented issues to people. So with the upside down ketchup bottle, of course, you don't have to shake it to get the ketchup out like you would do with the old glass bottles. You don't need to stick your knife up there to get ketchup out. It's squeezable and it's upside down so the ketchup falls to the bottom. And same thing with the shampoo bottle. So right off the bat, the user experience is usually talked about in terms of websites and apps. Well, here's something that's obviously neither of those things. My next example is from Disney World because I'm kind of a Disney nerd. But it's a picture of the Disney Magic Bands, which guests wear around their wrists. So they use that instead of using park tickets or room keys or fast passes. Everything is kind of stored on this device. And that makes for a much more seamless experience for people who are on vacation and they get to just kind of walk around and not worry about much because everything is held on their wrists, even dinner reservations, like you name it. And my last example is the Dollar Shave Club, which I do subscribe to. And I think this solves issues people might have with paying too much for razors or not having fresh blades all the time. Of course, it's targeted toward men, but women can use it too. And I think this screenshot itself is also a good example of a good user experience because the page itself makes it really easy for you to make comparisons between products before you decide to buy something. Okay, so bad user experience is kind of even more fun to talk about because we see design fails everywhere. I'm just going to point to iTunes and say that's one giant bad user experience. It wasn't always that way, but for some reason there's so many like menus and submenus and hidden things. And trying to sync music between my computer and phone is a nightmare, and it shouldn't be at all. Clippy, we all know and hate, as an example of a virtual agent who was possibly the most annoying possible thing, who would pop up while you were in a Word document, no matter what you were doing, and try to help you. Yep, rest in peace, Clippy. He's cute, but when you're trying to get something done, it was the most annoying thing. And doors. Almost every day, no, not almost every day, but really often we walk up to a door thinking we're cool and normal, and we pull on it when it's a push door, or we push on it when it's a pull door, and we look stupid. People blame themselves for these things, but really, like, the design of the door is bad. So you should be able to tell when you're walking up to a door what you're supposed to do with it. It should have a handle or a bar that kind of tells you what you're supposed to do. I wanted to add that accessibility is a big part of UX. Accessibility is designing experiences for those with physical or cognitive impairments. So, for example, the Americans with Disabilities Act from 1990 is why there are so many ramps to get into buildings, for example, and environments are more accessible to people in wheelchairs, for example. So there's an idea that when you design for the minority, people with impairments, you actually help everyone. So using the ramp example, that helps people who are in wheelchairs, but it also helps people pushing a stroller or carrying a lot of stuff at once, or someone who has a temporary injury. And on the digital side of things, websites are also required to be accessible so that people with visual impairments can use screen readers. But the process of organizing and labeling things on a website for a screen reader also makes it better organized for everyone else using it. And the last aspect of UX I wanted to bring up is designing for the future, which I think is the most fun thing. So that just means if you're working in user experience, you could just be working on your standard website, but you could also be thinking about these future experiences and getting involved before they're widespread use. So autonomous vehicles, wearables, smart home technology, these things are really just budding now. But it's important to know how we can use this technology to solve problems for people and to design it so it's user-friendly right from the beginning. Are there any questions so far about what user experience is? Or does anyone have an example of good or bad UX they're just dying to share? While I take a sip of water. It's funny that people bring up a lot of Apple experiences as bad when people also look to them as like the poster child of good design. I think a lot of Apple products they fall under that category of being designed to look really good, but sometimes the usability is lacking. The default font, for example, is like it's like gray, and very thin, so people with visual difficulties have trouble with Apple fonts. Yeah, and if the user experience is bad, sometimes we learn like workarounds for it. So there's a lot of legacy systems, we call them, stuff like Microsoft Office that's just been around forever. So it's not really going to be super redesigned maybe ever because we're all so used to it. Okay, well, feel free to keep typing comments. I'm going to start moving forward. So the next thing I'm going to talk about is some principles involved in user experience now that we're all kind of on board with what it is very broadly speaking. So in my mind, the overall goals of user experience are to meet user needs to solve a problem, reduce users' cognitive workload, which I don't get to use words like cognitive workload very often, so I'm excited to include it here. Basically making things easier to use so people don't have to think too much. Another goal is to follow heuristics or rules of thumb for designing or evaluating a user-friendly product. So there's a lot of established heuristics. I'm going to go over some of them in more detail, but we use those as kind of guidelines for knowing whether a design is good or not. And finally, to create enjoyment. So this is where user experience differs a little bit from usability or human factors, as we're not just worried about reducing error and being efficient. We also want people to enjoy the product they're using. So I'm going to go over 10 heuristics. Each one has its own slide, but just as an overview, Jacob Nielsen is an influential usability researcher. In the 90s, he identified 10 heuristics for user interface design. So as I go through them, keep in mind that this was something that was put into place in the 90s. So design has changed so much since then, but in part it was because we had this kind of knowledge in place where we started to understand that interfaces didn't have to look so bad or be so hard to use, that really anyone should be able to use the internet or software. You know, it's not just for engineers. But I'm trying to provide examples that are more modern because some of these principles seem like they're common sense, but they're really not. So the first heuristic is visibility of system status. So users should really know what's going on with the system, whether it's processing or uploading or waiting or whatever's going on. It gets really frustrating to not know what's going on when something's not responding. And that also includes receiving feedback quickly from action. So if someone hits a button on something, they should know immediately that the product recognizes that the button has been hit. So it's really about transparency so the user understands what's going on. So products are really good about this now, and it wasn't always the case. So people used to click buttons like 10 times in a row because they didn't know what was happening, and that would create kind of a log jam. So we're a little better about that. And by the way, with these heuristics, because it is kind of based on web interfaces, a lot of my examples are web interfaces, but user experience isn't just for the web, just a reminder there. So the second heuristic is a match between the system and the real world. So any metaphors, any language that's used, whatever the context is, it should match the user's expectation based on their real world experiences. So you wouldn't suddenly decide that green means stop and red means go. Some of my examples here, I just kind of pulled from my own life. Duolingo is that green owl, and that's that app for learning languages, which I love because it simplifies the process so much and the language is really understandable. So that's my example for that. It says learning a language requires practice every day. It doesn't say studies show that people on average learn. No, like it just tells you what you need to know. What language am I learning? Well, I used to speak French in college, which I forgot most of it, so I used it to brush up on French, and I also started learning German. And my sister got me to try Japanese, but that was like too hard for me. But I love Duolingo. If you're using a shopping bag or shopping cart metaphor, that kind of stuff works out pretty well because we understand the purpose of a shopping bag or a shopping cart in physical stores. And I threw the alarm example on there because I was thinking about how when alarm apps were first created, you know, they had to have things like a snooze button and those things that we're already used to with our other alarm clocks. Otherwise, people would have too much difficulty with it. The third heuristic is user control and freedom. This is one of those that seems really obvious, but it's about enabling users to freely navigate, make choices, and undo actions. So people need to be able to have freedom within the interface to do the things they're trying to do. I've got an example from the Nest thermostat, which lets you set temperatures and change them and change your settings, and an example from Spotify. So if I try to delete a playlist, it lets me undo that action before it's too late. The fourth heuristic is consistency and standards. So within an interface, you want all of the menus, buttons, the language you use to be consistent throughout the entire product. So for example, you wouldn't call something a shopping bag somewhere on a site and then a shopping cart somewhere else. You also want to be consistent with other designs in the world outside your product. So I pulled screens from 4 different websites, and you can see on the left of all of these headers is the logo for whatever site you're on, and to the right is the login information. So that's something that's really simple, but if you want to make people mad, you would switch that and put the login on the left, and people would spend a few extra seconds finding it and get frustrated. So the funny thing about this is, like I was saying before, user experience changes over time, so we kind of get used to technology the way it is. And that's something that's always evolving. Are there any questions right now? Yeah, anytime Twitter changes anything, it takes a little while to get used to. We just have to hope that people at Facebook, for example, whenever they make a change, I know they have a lot of good user experience researchers at Facebook, which is why I'm using that as an example, but they understand that when they're changing something, it's for a reason and it's based on a lot of research, and our instinct as humans is to not like whatever change is happening, but sometimes it just takes a little getting used to. So that's something that's pretty difficult about UX, is navigating how much do you keep things the same and how much are you kind of allowed to update and make things better. But if you're doing research, that's part of it. All right, so the 5th heuristic for designing good interfaces is error prevention. So things like spell check and autocorrect and suggestions are there to help prevent an error from even happening. So if you can, why not design out the possibility for an error? So a common example is disabling or graying out options that don't exist or aren't possible. So if you're filling out a form, maybe the submit button is grayed out until you filled out all the required sections, and then it lets you hit submit. So people tend to like that better than making the error and getting corrected later. The 6th heuristic is recognition rather than recall. So we know that humans are better at recognizing information than pulling it out of their mind and recalling it. So what you can do with that is suggest options, which might be customized based on prior usage. This is my Hulu screen, and look at that. I don't need to recall what I was watching. It tells me, it reminds me, oh yeah, I started Atlanta and I wanted to keep watching that without me really having to think about it. You can also provide relevant information when the user needs it. So if they need their username or order number or something like that, and you're able to retrieve it and include it where they need it, do that so they don't have to search through their emails or try to remember information. Yeah, some of it does get a little creepy. Even with the Disney Magic Band example, like you are sending all of your data to be kept in one spot. Like the band knows where you are, it knows what you're doing. So that gets like a little creepy, but again, it's just kind of the struggle of technology evolving, and if we're lucky, we have user experience people involved trying to think of ethics and all those things that other people might not be thinking about. Yeah, face recognition. So a lot of these things can make our lives easier, but we give up something in the process, like privacy or security. Those are big conversations that I don't know if I have opinions on. So the next heuristic is flexibility and efficiency. So if possible, you want to accommodate a range of users. So this is kind of similar to how in instructional design you want to accommodate learners at kind of a range of knowledge. So you want to allow users to do more or do less, like giving options to skip tutorials if they've already used a product, or giving options for maybe a basic or customized experiences. Like sometimes when you're downloading something, you have that option for a basic install or something more customized. My example for this is Slack. I don't know if anyone uses Slack, but it's a great messaging platform that I use for a lot of different projects, and I do consulting, so I communicate with different companies through Slack. There are different channels for different topics. But anyway, they are really great at providing customization. And I wanted to include Slack in particular because they let you change the theme. They let you change how the app looks, which is not that unique, but they do have 2 accessible themes. So that means 2 color schemes that work for different kinds of color blindness. So I think that's like a really great design choice that a lot of people might not know about. Yeah, Duolingo is a good example of testing out, so you don't have to sit and go through all the lessons if you already know some language. Okay, the 8th heuristic is aesthetic and minimalist design. So this is really where we're starting to get to how a thing actually looks. So think, is every aspect of the design necessary and useful? You want to avoid distraction and make it easy for people to find information. You don't want it to be cluttered. Just look at how the Google homepage looked in 1998 compared to now. There is still a header bar, but your focus on the Google page is just the search because that's what you're there for. But there's examples of this everywhere. We've really become accustomed to using things that are a little more minimalist than things used to be, but in the end that usually makes for a better user experience because people can more easily find what they're looking for. The 9th heuristic is to help users recognize, diagnose, and recover from errors. So remember, we would love to prevent errors from happening, but in the case that they do, you want to suggest a solution for them. So there's nothing worse than, well, there's a lot of worse things, but it's pretty bad when you get an error message that doesn't tell you what you've done wrong. It just tells you something's not working. Or when you're trying to log into something and you don't know whether you have your username wrong or your password wrong or both, and you've got no clues, and it's up to you to figure it out. So when you are helping users recover from an error, you want to tell them what the error is and tell them what to do about it in simple language, not technical terms. And the last of these heuristics is help and document. So it's pretty customary now for things to have manuals, for websites to have help pages, search fields, FAQs, and all of this information should be well organized and well categorized and easy for people to find and understand what they need to know to use your product. So this is all about easing frustration, making it easy for people, even if you have a complex product, helping them use it and learn how to use it. Any questions on those Nielsen's heuristics? Awesome. As always, just feel free to keep typing. So all of this, as you can figure out, is based on psychology. So it's about things like how human memory works and how we want to make things easier for people to remember what they need to know, to remember small amounts of information, to process small amounts of information at once. It's about creating emotional experiences that are positive emotions. So we want to avoid frustration and confusion, and we want people to feel, well, a lot of times they just feel neutral, which is fine, but we want them to feel good. We want them to like using the product. And this is about mental models. So again, terminology I don't get to use very often, but we want the design to match what people already have in mind. So when I was talking about matching experiences to real world experiences, we're really talking about matching up mental models so people know what to expect when they're using something. I wanted to get a little more advanced with this just for a few slides and talk about, beyond those basic heuristics, what aspects of psychology apply to UX. The first is a mouthful. It's the proximity compatibility principle, which simply says that we should be grouping elements together when they're related to a common task. Again, this seems like common sense, and it's totally not, actually. But my example is from Eventbrite. So all of the information someone needs to look at when and how much the event is all kind of huddled together. So the picture and the description are kind of extraneous. But if someone is actually wanting to buy tickets, all the information they need is grouped together. So that helps them accomplish that quickly. So if they're interested in buying a ticket, they can also quickly look at their calendar, and they're more likely to actually follow through and do it and buy the ticket because we've made it easy for them. But this applies to a ton of things. So if a user is going to need information, put it where they're going to need it. Visual hierarchy is a design principle, but the idea is that you want a page to be easily scannable. So a lot of times that means headings and subheadings and using visual elements to differentiate sections of, for example, a page. So with this Blue Apron example, it's very visual, but you can tell that the sign up now button is really what you're looking for. So it's an orange button as opposed to all the blue and white that's everywhere else, so it kind of stands out. And think of, a newspaper. The way newspapers are designed is that you should be able to see the headlines really quickly and know whether or not you're going to buy a paper, right? Now we use the internet instead of buying papers, but it's that idea of organizing information so that it's very easy to digest and you can tell what's what and things are labeled well. So the final example here is called Hick's Law, which states that the time it takes to make a decision depends on the number of choices. And there's actually math and numbers involved. That's why it's a law and not just a heuristic. But the actual idea is that if something is too complicated, people give up. Yeah, remotes are the worst because who's going to sit there and try to figure out from 50 buttons what one they need to get to the last channel they were on, for example. So if there's too many options, there's a resulting decision paralysis. So people just don't want to make a decision if you give them too much information at once. It becomes frustrating. This is especially critical for digital products, so websites or apps. Our attention span is really short. In general, if something is unclear, if we have too many options to choose from when we go to a website, we probably will give up pretty quickly. So there you go. That was a whole summary of UX heuristics and how psychology is involved. Are there any questions now?
Becca, I think Nicole had asked if there were any examples of something or current product that doesn't follow the proximity compatibility principle. So do you know of any
Oh,
examples that don't follow it regularly?
that's a good question.
And I guess that for the rest of the class too, do you know of any
Yeah.
examples?
Any examples of like when you have like when you're on a website and you have to have a lot of tabs open to get something done because you need different pages open? I can't think of specific examples right now, but can anyone else? I know that happens like pretty often, right? Maybe like when you're booking a flight? I don't know.
I think that might be a good example because sometimes they take you to like, oh, do you want to add a renter car or do you want to add a hotel? And then I don't know, that seems like a lot to me, but I don't know, maybe class
Yeah,
has other
yeah.
examples that they can think of.
Yeah, I'll have to think more about that. Any of those things where it just takes a lot of concentration and a lot of tabs. Maybe like registering for courses, I feel like a lot of times was like that, where maybe it would be more helpful to have your schedule as it is next to classes you're interested in. I don't know, stuff like that. Yeah, yeah. Oh, Outlook is a good example. Gmail has like a little calendar widget that you can have in your inbox client. Yeah, those are good examples. I mean, now of course you'll recognize things, in the next few days. You'll think back to this and get frustrated. All right. So for the next section, we actually don't have too much left, but I'm going to talk about some of the research methods that we use in user experience. So there's a few slides on this, and then I have a list of resources that are more like take home for you, and then we'll open it up to more Q&A and discussion. Okay, so our mantra is test early, test often. So ideally, user experience professionals are involved throughout the entire design and development lifecycle of a product. Unfortunately, a lot of times we're brought in at the very end to kind of test everything and kind of quote unquote make sure it's good. That's better than no research or testing, but that's not ideal. Um, Ideally, we would want to talk to users whenever possible. And by users, I don't mean the engineers building the product. I don't mean the designers. I don't mean the stakeholders at all. I mean people who are kind of outside the bubble who would be users of this product. So a lot of the research, it's similar to academic research. So I used to do a lot of academic research, but I learned very quickly that user research has to be a lot more flexible. The people I work with don't really care about sample size or any statistics or anything like that. It's really just more about what do they need to know and what do they need to do to fix it. So I made a table. This is just based on my own experiences comparing academic research to UX experience. So in academics, in academia, we're looking for statistical significance. And the purpose is we're trying to discover new things. We can kind of take our time working on things for a long time with multiple studies. And we mostly share it with other academics through journals, books, presentations. In the UX world, it's not like that really at all, although some of the methods are similar. But the goal is just an actionable insight. People, again, they want to know the bare minimum to do what they need to do. They don't really care about the details. And it's about business discovery, so it really kind of comes down to money a lot of times, because that's just how the world works. So we don't have the luxury of investigating problems and ideas just because we want to. It's more about paying for it. So it's about understanding what's going to create the best product that's actually going to sell. And it tends to be a lot shorter term with more deadlines and more people involved. Again, there's no real luxury of taking our time and getting enough participants. It's like whatever we can get, we take. The audience is product stakeholders, so people involved in that product. Sometimes it's the CEO of a company or investors to a company. For more complicated organizations, sometimes a lot of hands are involved. So when I do work with New York State on one of their web portals, there are so many people involved. And so many people have to see kind of my updates and try to get feedback. So it's about balancing a lot. And a deliverable is a design brief, if that. Sometimes my deliverable for clients is a spreadsheet that lists specifically what problems I found with testing and what they should do about it and how important it is. Sometimes they really don't care about any of your methods or anything like that. Are there any questions on the slide? Again, this is based on my own experience, so it might differ a little bit with other places, but I thought it was really interesting when I started to really figure this stuff out. Yes, I made that table. And I'm sure this is not specific only to user experience, but anyone who does like marketing research or research for a company will see some similarities there. I'm getting asked, in your experience, what typically is a good sample size to test for feedback? That's a really good question. Really, I will shoot for only around 5 people at a time, usually. So the idea is that you can find most of what you need to know by testing just 5 to 10 people. Of course, you're not going to find statistically significant differences, but that's really not your goal. Your goal is to find the biggest issues in a product and identify them. So it's better to test with fewer people and then just iterate more often. So test with 5 people, make some changes, test again until you kind of finish up. Sometimes I'm able to do bigger projects, but once you interview 5 to 10 people, once you kind of have 5 to 10 people interact with the product, you get a lot of repeat information. So for budget reasons, it doesn't really make sense to spend a lot on that because it's also pretty expensive in the real world to do testing. You actually have to pay people. So they're not doing it for course credit or just to support science. They're doing it because they want $50 or $75. With the same 5 people, it depends. It's better, I think, to get different people. So then you're getting kind of more insight, but depending on availability, it's not that bad to get the same people to come back and tell you whether it's better or not. But for budget reasons, it kind of makes more sense to get different participants for each phase because you're going to get more valuable feedback that way. And yeah, $75 is what I pay the people who test that New York State web portal. Like, I wanted to test it and get $75. But, I mean, you figure people have to travel to you, take time out of their day, find the place, work with you for an hour, But I give anywhere from $10 to $75, depending on what it is. And if it's like a startup company, we give, $5 Starbucks gift cards. But kind of the bigger the organization, the more they can pay for that, and then the better you can recruit, really. An example of the kind of question surveys you might use in UX research. Yeah, that could be its own topic. I don't have any slides going like that specific. In general, it's less about surveys and more about watching people interact with the product and kind of asking them questions about it. And also observing what they're doing. So a lot of questions actually come up front, just trying to figure out who the user is, whether they use similar products to get their job done or to whatever it happens to be, whatever the context is. Ask them kind of what they're currently doing to understand whether your product fills any need. If it's a product that already exists, you find out whether they use it already and whether they like it and kind of difficulties they have with it. The surveys are what I use just to kind of attach numbers to things and make sure we're moving in a positive direction as we iterate on a product design. So there are established usability questionnaires that are validated that I use. The system usability scale, the SUS, is an example of one that I use. Do you use any technology to gain feedback, such as eye movement scanners in marketing? Yeah. Yes, I have used a face reader, so facial recognition to read emotion. I haven't done a whole lot with eye tracking, but that's definitely a really big area of UX research is eye tracking to understand what people are looking at and how long they're looking at it and whether they're seeing the things they're supposed to and stuff like that. So all right. Any other questions on this table? So very broadly, the kinds of research we do, I can break down into two different phases. The first is kind of the strategy phase or the discovery phase. So like I said, that's kind of understanding what the problem space is, what current tools exist, and what are the user requirements. So what does the user need from a product? And for this, I'll use surveys, focus groups, interviews, task analysis. That's just to understand exactly what tasks people would be performing and why and how. And that includes market research to understand what other products exist. So this phase, I mean, every phase looks completely different for different projects because you're really adapting to whatever you're working on. So sometimes you're kind of inheriting something that already exists. Sometimes it's a product from scratch. Sometimes the users are, for example, doctors. So you have to really understand the context in which they work. Sometimes it's for kids. So, I mean, this looks different all the time. And the kinds of tools I use will be different for every project. The other real research phase is product testing. So that's where I'm looking more at, is this design user-friendly? Does it meet our goals? So it's kind of checking back with those goals and requirements and seeing whether it needs improvements or not, and it almost always does. So for qualitative research during testing, I use surveys and interviews. I don't really use focus groups for this phase. It's not super effective to test a product that way. I will use focus groups during discovery to kind of get an idea of problems people are facing in general, and sometimes that conversation helps move that along. But when I'm testing a product, you don't really want people to be influenced by their group. you might have one loud person who really dislikes something, and that kind of sways the whole group. So I stick to surveys and interviews when I'm testing the product. And for quantitative data, I again use surveys. A lot of times that'll be something more like the system usability scale, something that has, validated scores. You can use time and errors. If it's a digital product, the number or percent of clicks, and web analytics. So on the website itself, see how many people use something after you've made changes. So that's very naturalistic, and just, you can understand a lot about what people are doing, but not necessarily why. So again, every project is totally different, and I use a variety of methods for each project to get a lot of information. So my last real slide is, how is user experience related to instructional design? And this is where I'd really like to hear from you guys. I have a few ideas that I put down here, but I definitely want to hear your thoughts too. The design of the product is similar in both disciplines, and that poor designs are distracting. Good organization of information is easier for people to digest, and design influences affect or emotion. So we're all thinking about all of those things. For the research side of things, we all need to understand users' ranges in skills and knowledge when we're creating something, and we have to test outcomes to know whether our designs are effective. Are there any other ideas? This is where I love to learn a little bit from you guys. Yeah, learnability is definitely important in instructional design, but that's one facet of user experience too, is how quickly do people learn how to use the product. Accessibility, yeah, definitely. All right, so I'm leaving you with some resources. This is a list of important names if you're interested in learning more from people besides me involved in the industry. Here's a list of mostly Twitter accounts. But if you just search their names, you'll also find their websites and things they write and anything like that. So I wanted to leave you with that, and a suggestion of books to read that are at a really easy to understand. Yes, I did make the list. So if I'm missing anyone on that list, I feel bad. And here's some books that are really easy to understand at kind of a beginner's level, about what user experience is and why it's important. So that is it for my presentation. While I was talking, did anyone come up with other examples of products that they love or hate? This is always really fun. I like the Kindle UX as well. One thing I really liked about it initially is they were not backlit the way like an iPad is. So you could take it outside and it was more like natural reading conditions than an
I think we
iPad
have
or a
quite a few
screen would be.
iPhone lovers. I Well, I actually have a couple of questions for you that I've
Yeah,
just kind of been writing as you've been going through the
I love money
presentation.
too.
Um, so one thing I wanted to ask you, and it kind of relates to user experience, but it actually relates more to your journey as a UX consultant. And I know we have several students in the program who are going to be working as instructional designers for an organization, but we also have students that are considering becoming instructional design consultants. So can you speak a little bit about your journey into going into UX consulting?
Yeah, I would love to. So like I said, I went to school for human factors. I kind of had in mind for a while that I would want to start a company when I was done. And I didn't really know what that would look like. So while I was in grad school, I kind of realized that switching focus a little bit to user experience would be beneficial. Because like I said, that's kind of a buzzword. Um, People are writing about it all the time. People are looking for UX help. So I made that switch. And I started the company a lot earlier than I would have expected. I was still in grad school when I started the company. I found that there was a need for UX work, so I didn't really see a reason to wait. um, and that was so I went to grad school in Virginia and I moved back to Albany, which is home for me. So I knew I kind of wanted to stick around here for a while, and there was not a lot of user experience or human factors or instructional design or any of these things that I'd come to love. So I decided to create a little space for myself, and I started networking. So my advice is to network as much as you really feel comfortable doing. So I went to all kinds of events for designers, for developers, for entrepreneurs, and it took a little while for me to build up a network. But that was really the hardest part, was getting to know what other companies were around and what kind of work they were seeking and how I could help them, and to develop kind of trust within the community. Of course, today we're not limited to just where we are geographically. I chose to kind of really focus on local work as a way to promote the economy here and really develop a sense of community. But you can also network in other ways. If it's not in person, you can be involved in national organizations or international organizations and really start to meet people that way. So the most important thing is building up a list of people you trust, who trust you, who you would like to work with. And that's hard at first because you're stepping outside and talking to people who are not in your field, right? The people in your field, you might get referrals that way. You might be able to work with people that way, but they're not your clients. So it's about getting to know who your clients are going to be.
Thank
And
you,
I'm happy to
Becca.
answer any other
I
questions
also have another
about
question.
that
I
that I
always
didn't
have all the
cover.
questions. Um, um, so when you were sharing that slide about, academic research versus like research in the real world for practical application, it seems like, in the real world, research is, or UX world is like, I want to have knowledge right now and I want to apply it right now because my product needs to come out and people need to use it. But you also mentioned that sometimes US is sacrificed, so the research is not done. Why do you think that investigation is sacrificed?
I think it's easy for people to forget about it. I think people get really in their own heads about their products. And when you spend so much time and effort building something, it's hard to step outside that and recognize that the people using it are not you. Um, and it's hard to recognize the need to bring in researchers and people to help with that. And a lot of times products fail because they really don't think about it at all, or they think about it not enough. So that's always a struggle that I face with clients and with jobs I've had, is trying to have my voice heard and part of that involves me understanding what things to really push for because they're really important and what things to kind of let go when I have to because sometimes a product launch is more important than everything being exactly perfect, right? So that's why with my research, I give not only my list of recommended changes, but I also attach importance to each one so that the decision makers know which parts are the most important things. They must fix this before it goes anywhere else, and which things are kind of like nice to have changes to at least help them make that decision. Because if you come at them with everything, you're just going to get rejected. So it's kind of like that thing I was talking about where if people have too many choices and too much coming at them, they just kind of shut down. That's what I don't want to happen. Yeah, pick your battles. So definitely learn to do that.
Thank
But
you.
it's an
Does anyone have
ongoing
any
struggle
other
all the
questions
time.
for Becca? And I apologize, baby, in the background.
And anyone can feel free to email me later.
Okay, well, I appreciate your presentation so much. We have a recording of it, so I will make sure to share this with the class, and we will be sharing it in our social media channels and via email for others to see that were unable to join us today. Um, and I just feel like we last week we talked about multimedia principles, and they were fairly theoretical, and the class can tell you about that. But I feel like the UX presentation you have given us today has provided some practical application of how we need to think about user experience, and also how we need to think about user experience and connecting it with instructional design practice. So I thank you very much for that. Any other comments from the students in the class that you would like to share via chat or unmute your mics?
And thank you guys for keeping the chat going. That was really helpful because I can't obviously see anyone. So it's nice to know you're there.
Okay, well, it looks like everyone's very pleased, and Greg says a round of applause. Yay! Well, thank you very much, Becca. We're gonna call it a night. And thank you for joining us from upstate New York. Um, I guess unless there are any questions, we are just gonna call it a night for tonight. So I'll be in touch via email, and again, I will share the recording with you, with the students, and with everyone else. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Good
Thank
night.
you.